Hi, this is Ted, and you're listening to a reading of features from the New York Times, the Monday, December 22nd New York Times, on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. I apologize again, I was traveling yesterday and couldn't read the news, but I will today read opinion pieces that have not gone out of date. So the first one is called I asked ChatGPT to solve an 800-year-old Italian mystery. What happened surprised me, by Ilan Danziger. Across from the Florence Cathedral in Italy stands a much older church, the Baptistry of San Giovanni. San Giovanni. It is a beloved center of religious life where many Florentines are baptized to this day. Staid columns and lively arches hug its 8 sides, half camouflaged in patterns of green and white marble. Without the baptistry's emulation of the architecture of ancient Rome, it's hard to imagine Florence birthing the architectural renaissance that changed the face of Europe. Yet for centuries there has been no compelling solution as to who built it and when and for what reason. Decades ago, I gave tours of the baptistry and came to revere it. And in the early 2020s, I began delving into its origins. After years of poring over historical documents and reading voraciously, I made an important discovery that was published last year. The baptistry was built not by Florentines, but for Florentines, specifically as part of a collaborative effort led by Pope Gregory VII after his election in 1073. My revelation happened just before the explosion of artificial intelligence into public consciousness, and recently I began to wonder, could a large language model like ChatGPT, with its vast libraries of knowledge, crack the mystery faster than I did? So, as part of a personal experiment, I tried running 3 AI chatbots, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, through different aspects of my investigation. I wanted to see if they could spot the same clues I had found, appreciate their importance, and reach the same conclusions I eventually did. But the chatbots failed. Though they were able to parse dense texts for information relevant to the baptistry's origins, they ultimately couldn't piece together a wholly new idea. They lacked essential qualities for making discoveries. There are a few reasons for this. Large language models have read more text than any human could ever hope to. But when AI reads text, it's merely picking up patterns, peculiar details, outlier data, and unusual perspectives that can influence thinking can get lost. Without eccentric or contrarian ideas, I never would have made my discoveries. For example, in his 2006 book, Toscana Romanica, Guido Tigler, a professor at the University of Florence, argued that the baptistry was built later than generally believed. It's an idea that's not widely accepted, and I believe that's the reason the chatbots never presented it to me when I asked them what they would need to solve the enigma of the baptistry. Although I ultimately found reason to reject the later dating, Mr. Tigler's unorthodox ideas taught me to more strongly consider the possibility that past scholarship had gotten the timeline for the baptistry wrong. For centuries, many people believed Pope Nicholas II consecrated the baptistry in 1059. There's actually no known record of such an event. Its existence is based on an assumption drawn from documents that show his involvement with other Florentine churches that year. When I nudged the chatbots to discover this discrepancy themselves, ChatGPT and Claude found it, but failed to observe that it was suspicious, whereas Gemini hallucinated evidence that would eliminate this discrepancy. To contribute to a field of knowledge, you need to accurately survey the landscape, sniff out what's fishy, and demonstrate why it's rotten. Large language models have trouble on all 3 counts. And here's the deeper problem. Sometimes pattern recognition, human and machine, is wrong. Though there was no confirming evidence, most scholars had simply assumed the patrons of the baptistry were Florentine. After all, a vast majority of church building in the Middle Ages was driven by local people, bishops, abbots, wealthy families. But from my readings, I began to agree more and more with the fringe view that the inhabitants of 11th century Florence were still too poor and provincial to produce such an accomplished building. The key to identifying who built the baptistry was how much its architecture is inspired by the ancient Pantheon in Rome. By the 11th century, the Pantheon had become a church officiated only by the Pope. Once you take Pope Nicholas out of the equation and focus on pontiffs obsessed with ancient Rome, only one name for our mystery patron comes to mind: Gregory VII. A few years before Gregory's election in 1073, Florentines had stopped having their children baptized in Florence, fearful that a reputedly corrupt bishop could not protect their infant souls. After an event proved the bishop's unworthiness and sent him packing, the formidable rulers of Florence and all of Tuscany, Beatrice of Bar and her daughter Matilda, seem to have made amends to the city by working with Gregory to give it a magnificent new baptistry. The sumptuous evocation of Roman splendor in the heart of Florence is exactly the kind of church architecture Gregory would have patronized. Synthesizing so many pieces of medieval history into a new interpretation required stepping back and reconsidering their importance and how they relate to one another. AI may be able to optimize the process of collecting those pieces, but discovery means drawing new connections, something far beyond current AI capabilities, as the tests I did confirmed to me. Discovery remains a human endeavor and is propelled by the very human quality to see oddities that don't fit patterns and by examining them more deeply. And here is The Most Important Thing We Learned from Susie Wiles by Frank Bruni. Vice President J.D. Vance is, quote, a conspiracy theorist. Russell Vogt, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, isn't merely a zealot. He's a, quote, right-wing absolute zealot. And President Trump governs with an, quote, alcoholic's personality. Ever since the publication last week of a two-part article in Vanity Fair in which Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, said all of that and more, political observers have been asking, why did she do it? Why discard her usual discretion and speak so frankly, on the record, about her cracked compatriots in the Trump administration? It's a great question, but it's not the most important one, which is this. Why does she do it? I'm referring not to the interview, but to her job. If she can see the incoherence, immoderation, and instability all around her, why abet it? To both questions, the answer, or at least one of the answers, is surely the same. Wiles has been given a plum part in history, not to mention a history-making part, in that she's the first woman in her role. She relishes that enough to want recognition, enough to consent to 11 interviews with the journalist Chris Whipple, enough to position herself during those conversations as the even-keeled sage appraising everyone around her. How fitting that Whipple's portrait of her appeared in a publication named Vanity Fair. She told Whipple at one point, I don't ever seek attention, a statement that's a laugh line, though it's unclear whether Whipple saw it that way, and it's obvious that Wiles didn't. I repeat, 11 interviews. Over the course of nearly a year, she spoke to Whipple on Sundays after going to church. She spoke to him while she was doing laundry. She left an Oval Office meeting early to go speak with him. The Garbo of the West Wing, she's not. The first year of Trump's return to the White House has shown or reminded us of many things, including the fragility of democracy, the prevalence of cowardice, and the intensity of tribalism. But it has been an especially stark and galling education in the intoxication of power. And Wiles is a more illuminating entry on that syllabus than other senior administration officials who wear their vainglory so conspicuously it might as well be a sandwich board spelling out their attachment to their entourages, to their letterheads, to the pomp and the perks. Many of them, Pete Hegseth, Robert Kennedy Jr., Kash Patel, lack the credentials to be given anything remotely resembling such high-ranking jobs by anyone other than a destructionist like Trump, and they're surely too thrilled by their outrageous fortune to gaze skeptically at any uncomely aspect of it. Besides which, those three, along with other presidential aides and advisors, are as rapacious, reckless, and altogether rotten as Trump. But Wiles is different. She's a seasoned political pro who is often, relative to others in her line of work, kept to the background. She doesn't take to social media to advertise her every brain spasm as some eureka insight and rapidly monitor the odometer of likes and shares. She had prominent political assignments before Trump and could have significant political roles independent of him. And she has never come across as an ardent ideologue, so dedicated to certain policy aims that all manner of compromise in their service would be okay. But when Trump beckoned her to join him as he returned to the White House, she came. She came despite her awareness of how quickly he'd cycled through chiefs of staff and other senior aides during his previous term. She came despite knowing, as does any sensate creature, even casually observing America over the past decade, how vicious and volatile he can be. She came with eyes open to his biases, having worked on all three of his presidential campaigns. Briefing Whipple on Trump's tropisms, she observed, "He said it a million times. I judge people by their genes." That nugget drew less notice than the digs at Vance and Vote, but it's a doozy, especially given Trump's frequent rants about immigration and IQ. Whipple's portrait of her suggests that she is in many ways ideologically simpatico with Trump and genuinely believes that he has done good. She acknowledges excesses and sloppiness regarding tariffs, deportations, and more, but she says that sometimes to restore balance, you must yank things hard in the direction opposite from where they stand. She seems to hold some cabinet members in high regard. Her favorites inexplicably include Kennedy, whom she refers to as my Bobby. The my fascinates. Like posing for glamour shots in a celebrity-centric magazine, it challenges her reputation for self-effacement. But that sort of reputation can be as deliberate as any other. To be known as the humble deckhand who steadies an otherwise rocky ship is nonetheless to be known. To be seen as someone who doesn't insist on getting credit is to get an especially flattering kind of credit. She described for Whipple how she sits far to the side during televised Oval Office gatherings so she's off camera. But isn't she edging her way back into the shot by telling Whipple that? Wiles is certainly no Hegseth, showily doing push-ups with the troops, no Patel with his premature expectorations, no Kristi Noem zipping down to El Salvador for a macabre photo op. But she's also human with an itch to make sure that her presence and her sway at the pinnacle of power don't go unnoticed, unrecorded, underappreciated. Even someone like Wiles savors the air up there, even if it's toxic with conspiracy theories and zealotry. In the Wall Street Journal, Jason Gay rued the effect of a repeated granular slow-mo video forensics, that is, obsessive replays on the determination of what, in pro football, constitutes a catch. It's the affliction of overthinking. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, wait, hold on, it must be a chandelier, he wrote. It's further evidence humans can ruin the spirit of anything if given the time and technology. Gay also marveled at the return of the quarterback Philip Rivers, 44, who retired and was coaching high school football to replace an injured starter for the Indianapolis Colts in their recent game against the Seattle Seahawks, which the Colts lost. They also lost last night. He threw longer passes that wobbled and shorter passes that coughed and sputtered before reaching their receivers. In the pocket, he moved like a man trying to make a sandwich in the dark, said Jeffrey Morris, a reporter among others. In The Athletic, Mike Sando nonetheless saluted Rivers, a jolly 44-year-old grandfather 5 years removed from his game, who led a go-ahead drive in the final minutes at Seattle as his Indianapolis Colts nearly pulled an upset for the aged. Also, you're listening to a reading of features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's an essay called Three Experts on Vaccines, Measles, and Kennedy. So much has changed in American public health under the leadership of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Alexandria Sifferlin and Alex Ellerbeck, two editors in opinion, convened a discussion with the public health practitioners Dr. Rachel Bedard, Dr. Michael Mina, and Dr. Caitlin Rivers to take stock of a tumultuous year, including vaccine recommendations changes, measles outbreaks, and the future of public health in America. The conversation has been edited for clarity. Alexandra Sifferlin begins. Reporting suggests that the Department of Health and Human Services is planning to overhaul the childhood vaccine schedule to recommend fewer vaccines for children and make the schedule recommendations closer to Denmark's, which doesn't currently recommend immunization against respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, as well as other diseases like rotavirus, hepatitis A, flu, meningitis, and chickenpox. Is this dangerous? Dr. Bedard answers, I think it would be a huge mistake to do this. It makes no sense. The rationale is a vague idea about fewer vaccines and less cumulative exposure to vaccine adjuvants like aluminum that have been proved safe time and time again. RSV and meningitis kill children. Chickenpox infection can be terrible and, maybe more important, sets people up to get shingles later in life, which we now know potentially accelerates cognitive decline. It would be a major advance for the anti-vax movement and a major step backward for the health of American children if implemented. Or, more likely perhaps, such a change will only serve to further harm the credibility of the health agencies and create a situation where states look to other authorities for guidance. Dr. Rivers says, these vaccines protect kids and communities. We have some of the world's best public health and vaccine scientists. There's no reason to make any policy decisions without our own careful, transparent review, as has been the standard for decades. And Dr. Mina says, these pathogens are not benign, and we vaccinate against them for key reasons. With the exception of the flu vaccine, the childhood vaccines that are potentially on the chopping block if we go the way of Denmark are all vaccines that we provide to our children to confer protection through most of their lives. These vaccines are not unnecessary interventions, but crucial educations to the immune system that support our children as they develop into adults and even older age. A move to reduce their uptake or reduce access would drive unnecessary disease for people we love and aim to care for the most. It's one thing to question timing of the vaccines, but to potentially remove the vaccines from a recommendation altogether is not encouraging a more healthy public, but inviting disease that we are so lucky to now have generations of people who have never had to think about, specifically because of the vaccine successes. The reporter asks, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention also recently changed its guidance on the hepatitis B vaccine, following advice from its advisory committee on immunization practices. All of the committee's members were appointed by Kennedy. The agency has stopped its practice of recommending the shot for all newborns within 24 hours of birth, although parents can still opt to get it after consulting with their doctors. The shot is still recommended at birth for the babies of women who do not screen negative for hepatitis B in pregnancy. What do you make of that change? Dr. Mina. I went into the meeting open to the idea that we could be more flexible about the birth dose. Right now, we tell all parents that they need to vaccinate their kids within 24 hours of birth. but I think there's room for some flexibility on timing if a woman tests negative for hepatitis B and is also very low risk, as long as the baby gets the vaccine by about 2 months. That type of flexibility is actually something we had in 1991 guidelines. Instead, the advisory committee took the extraordinary step of saying people should not get the vaccine before 2 months of age and left it unclear when, if ever, they should get the vaccine. I thought that demonstrated something very scary about the group, which is that it made a decision that went against the safety and effectiveness data. Dr. Rivers. What stood out to me was the departure from the usual process. Historically, there would be working groups formed that could spend months or even years going through the scientific evidence and documenting everything they're finding, and then that process would culminate in a committee vote. That's not what happened. Dr. Bedard, I was also pretty appalled. To Mike's first point, there's a conversation to be had about whether it might be reasonable to potentially allow a more flexible recommendation for parents who are hesitant to give their child a hepatitis B vaccine dose on day 1 of life if they are negative for the virus. But that wasn't the conversation. There was lots of insinuating about safety concerns when that's not something we have data to support. The reporter asks, how concerned should Americans be about this change? Dr. Minna, I don't think the average person needs to be concerned today about the hepatitis B decision specifically. The vaccine wasn't removed from the market, so any people who don't want their baby to get hepatitis B still have a very good tool for it. I don't think we're going to see rampant hepatitis B because of this. What I am very concerned about is what it reflects about the future. This is still year 1 of this administration. Now that it has the rails greased, I think we should be very concerned about what it means long term for recommendations for the rest of the children's vaccine schedule and healthcare more generally, especially since reporting suggests that the administration wants to change the schedule. Dr. Rivers says, I agree with Michael's comments. To push back on some assumptions, the hepatitis B vaccine is very popular, and indeed, most childhood vaccines are very popular. Around 9 in 10 parents did not delay or skip the hepatitis B dose. Does skepticism from 1 in 10 parents merit a revision of the recommendation? I don't see why it would. There are other vaccines that are a lot less popular that we still universally recommend because it's the right thing to do in terms of population health. I don't think it's the case that there was some great demand for this recommendation to be softened because it's quite popular. Dr. Bedard. There was demand from a special interest group, the anti-vaccine movement, and in that way I see all this as very similar to the pro-life movement, where a small segment of the population that has extreme feelings around an issue and that's very organized pushes through its agenda. Alex Ellerbeck, another reporter. Dr. Bedard, you said there might be room to debate some limited flexibility in vaccine recommendations, but that wasn't what the committee debated. Is that a discussion still worth having? Or to Dr. Rivers' point, does it just amplify the desires of a very small minority and cause more harm than benefit? Dr. Bedard. In my ideal world, it's not that we would make changes to vaccine recommendations. It's that we would think really critically about a research agenda that helps us understand the sociological phenomenon of rising vaccine hesitancy that we see unfolding right now. How can policy best fit the reality of where the American people are and how they're behaving in this moment? Such a research agenda is very far afield from anything we've seen from this administration, even though they often cite diminishing trust as a rationale for what they do. The other reporter. As Dr. Rivers said, most people in America vaccinate their children, but vaccine hesitancy is growing. According to a KFF Washington Post poll, about 1 in 6 Americans delayed or skipped the vaccine dose. Now we're seeing measles outbreaks pop up around the country. How is this best addressed? Dr. Rivers. I don't dispute that vaccine hesitancy is increasing. I think we see that very clearly in the data. But it nonetheless remains true that coverage is very high. And if you look at the hepatitis B vaccine, for example, the lowest covered group is among people who are uninsured. So as we head into 2026, we need to see issues around access and affordability as important contributors to reduced vaccine coverage. I don't want us to be distracted, I guess, by a single aspect like hesitancy when there is still a whole host of issues that keep us from creating the conditions for good health for as many people as possible. Dr. Bedard, there's not measles everywhere. There's measles in communities well below the vaccine threshold for herd immunity. For example, outbreaks have occurred in Mennonite communities in West Texas, where two children recently died of measles, the first such deaths in the United States in years. To Caitlin's point, there's a context that goes beyond vaccine hesitancy as a strongly held attitude in that community. The Mennonite community in West Texas is not anti-vaccine because of Robert Kennedy Jr. That community has strong beliefs about the body, religion, technology, and how they interact with secular society generally. There's also a high proportion of unvaccinated folks who are undocumented and who are going into the shadows right now because they don't feel safe seeking health care. That's going to affect vaccine rates. Medicaid cuts and rising health care premiums will as well. That's not a vaccine hesitancy issue, necessarily. A reporter, is there a risk of a huge measles outbreak in the U.S.? Dr. Rivers, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, or MMR vaccine, is very effective and for most people confers lifelong protection. A vast majority of people, something like 90% of Americans, have received the MMR vaccine and are protected from infection. That being said, we will continue to see these percolating outbreaks that take a long time to get under control and are dangerous to the affected communities. In South Carolina, for example, we're seeing hundreds of children out of school because they have been exposed and are not vaccinated. For most people, I don't think it's an imminent threat, but it is absolutely disruptive. Dr. Mina, it depends what you mean by huge. Is it a huge outbreak relative to elimination? Yes. But is it going to affect everyone? No. Like Caitlin said, most people are vaccinated. I think we can expect to see thousands of cases over this year and next year. Many more cases will go unidentified or unrecorded. A silver lining is that we are being reminded of just how protective and long-lasting the MMR vaccine is, because tens of thousands of vaccinated people have likely been exposed, and there's been few infections among the vaccinated. People ask if they need to get revaccinated, and the short answer is that, with the exception of the immune compromised, you're going to be quite safe if you got the vaccine years ago. Dr. Bedard, can I ask the epidemiologists a question that I get a lot? What about infants under a year old and parents who are worrying about potential exposure or whether they should vaccinate early, since the first dose of the MMR vaccine is typically recommended at age 12 through 15 months? Dr. Mina, it's safe to give an MMR vaccine down to 6 months. A child with measles could walk through the grocery store, and if you come through 2 hours later with your unvaccinated infant, your child could get measles. It's that contagious. So it's worth thinking about getting an early vaccination if you are in a community with ongoing spread. But for a majority of people, I don't think it's that important at the moment. The reporter, how do you think about Kennedy's influence long term? Will public health forever be shaped by MAHA, or will we look back to the Kennedy era as a blip? Dr. Bedard, there's been significant institutional destruction at Health and Human Services, and more broadly to the country's global health programs that are not a blip and will be very hard to rebuild, like the dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development. As for Kennedy, I do think that public health is going to be dealing with the ramifications of him and this period for a very long time. We need to think really hard about how to meet the public where it is, even if Kennedy's leadership at HHS turns out to be short-lived. Dr. Mina, if you asked public health people if they were super happy with how the CDC was run before the pandemic or how the National Institutes of Health funded research, I think many would have said no. But there wasn't a lot of political will to significantly update things. We can't undo what's been done, and there's no point in arguing that we should just go back. So let's start planning for what's next. How can we make the most out of this? The optimist in me would like to think we can come out of this with a better system. And you're listening to a reading of features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Dr. Bedard, the reporter. Post-pandemic, it seems personal freedom has become an even greater value in people's health decision-making. How can the public be persuaded now to embrace the kind of collective action that public health requires? Dr. Bedard. There are lots of areas in which public health works really hard to create policy and recommendations with a deep respect for people's autonomy. Harm reduction is about acknowledging that people are going to behave or make choices that potentially put themselves at risk, and then creating policy that decreases the risk of those behaviors. That's a public health innovation. Because Kennedy has made vaccines so front and center this year, we've talked a lot about vaccine policy, which is complicated because of the need to achieve herd immunity for certain potentially deadly infections in order to keep everybody safe. There may be ways to think about doing harm reduction around vaccine policy. I don't know that that's necessary, but I'm a big believer in harm reduction principles and bringing them into all areas of our work. Dr. Rivers. For infectious diseases, the choices that you make for yourself and your family also affect other people. If you are infected, you become infectious. So it's not just a choice for you, it's a choice that affects the entire community. If we do need to make some changes around vaccine policy, for example, then we really need to be thinking about what corresponding changes we need to make that successful. Flexibility around the hepatitis B dose already exists, for example. These are recommendations that families can choose to accept, decline, or delay. But if that's going to become more common, then we need to be thinking about how to make better vaccine registries, which is done at the state level, and the quality is very varied. How do you know if a baby has received the hepatitis B vaccine? In some health systems, this is easy, it's electronic. In other health systems, you may never know. When was the last time you, as an adult, got your tetanus booster? You often have to keep track of that information yourself. What I'm gesturing at here is not so much the specifics of hepatitis B, but all the other accompanying conversations that need to happen when you make such changes. The other reporter. We've talked about the future, but I'd also like to ask about how we got to a place where a vaccine critic is leading HHS. Do you view this moment as a result of backlash to public health that requires deep soul searching, or is there a risk of overinterpreting that, and this is an overcorrection? Dr. Rivers. I'm always wary about doing something in order to affect a third latent variable. What I mean is that it really bothers me when I hear my infectious disease colleagues say something like, the risk to the American public is low. And what they mean by that is, I don't want you to worry. But does that actually correspond to the true risk? Not always. Take the hepatitis B birth dose, for example. I think we should make the best recommendation based on the evidence and what we know about the risks, the benefits, values, and priorities, which is the framework the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices used to use. That should be the recommendation. I'm not really in favor of pulling back out of a sense that some people don't accept it. We need to begin with recommendations that best protect communities and their health, and from there figure out how to meet them where they are, whether through improving access and affordability or addressing their concerns. Dr. Bedard, I think it's important for everyone, including people in the public health establishment, to think critically about what variable we're optimizing for. I worry that we're currently optimizing for protecting the sanctity of current vaccine policy rather than the variable we should care about most, minimizing the harms of infection. If we make preventing and minimizing harms of infection our primary goal, I push back slightly to say that while getting vaccine rates to where they need to be is obviously a huge priority, there are also other things we can and should do. There have been anti-vaxxers in this country since its earliest days. There are likely to be vaccine-hesitant communities forever. Vaccines cannot be the only thing we offer anti-vax communities. We need to think about building trust with them so that they are willing to engage in other strategies, testing, surveillance, quarantine, treatment, even when they won't accept vaccines. Dr. Mina, I think the original question was, is Kennedy as health secretary a backlash against public health? I don't think so. Over the last 20 years, I've been getting to know people who are vaccine hesitant, and I would say that a vast majority of people who are vaccine hesitant or who might be labeled anti-public health are actually very pro-health. They just rely on different information. When people don't vaccinate their kids, it's not because they don't care about their kids or because they want their kids to get sick. It's because they love their kids so much and they're genuinely confused. If you're genuinely confused, the most appealing approach is the one that doesn't stick a needle into your kid's arm. We should try to understand why one of the most prominent anti-vaccine misinformation gurus is now leading health in America. We could look back with a jaded lens, or we can try to understand why people are making the choices they're making. It's a hard nut to crack, but it deserves rigorous discussion and a little less dismissal. And I'll conclude with my favorite, David French. He's not really my favorite, but I really like him. His essay is called Christianity is a Dangerous Faith. Religion is one of the most dangerous forces on earth. If you've ever encountered true fundamentalists, you know why. When you combine eternal stakes with absolute certainty, it produces the kind of people who are happy to be cruel in the name of God. In fact, they can view their cruelty as a form of kindness. If they treat you with decency, doesn't that make you comfortable in your sin? It's important for them to take opportunities to confront people when you can. In other words, to tell people that they're wrong, often in the most strident of ways. How else will they understand the gravity of their own sin? To the fundamentalist, disagreement is proof of apostasy. But it can be even worse than that. If you're wrong, then you might lead other people into error, and that makes you dangerous. That's one reason fundamentalists of all stripes are often such zealous censors. A fundamentalist can see every person who's wrong as a kind of patient zero in a potential pandemic of paganism. And don't think for a moment that fellow believers are spared the fundamentalist's ire. They're a chief target. They have no excuse for their errors, and they receive the most vitriol of all. The same principle can be applied to secular fundamentalists. Perhaps you've met them. The people who define themselves through their individual politics, who show a kind of sneering contempt for dissent, and are very, very concerned with who is platformed and who is not. Nothing I'm saying is original. I'm relaying an observation that's been true since the first spark of faith in the human heart. There is a quiet, dark voice that whispers, "You are right, they are wrong. It is best for everyone if you rule." Now let's talk about the Christmas story. Every year, like clockwork, a series of debates breaks out in Christian America. When Jesus was born in a manger, did that mean he was homeless? When Jesus fled with his family to Egypt to escape King Herod's order to kill all baby boys in the region of Bethlehem, did that mean he was a refugee? And when his family entered and lived in Egypt until Herod died, did that mean he was an immigrant? You can see why the debate matters, whether or not you are a believer. If the man Christians believe is the Messiah, part of the Trinity, the maker of heaven and earth, wasn't just human, but also a human of low social status in the ancient world, and never elevated himself to any position of power on earth, then that has immense implications for believers who want to imitate Christ. If you can somehow distinguish the facts of Jesus' birth from the realities of the modern world, however, then you can push it away. It becomes just an ancient origin story, a matter more of academic interest than anything else. I tend to think it's a waste of time to debate whether Jesus fits into any specific modern legal or cultural category. For what it's worth, I don't think he was homeless. His family was on a trip, and there's no indication that they had no home at all. But I do think he was a refugee by any fair definition of that term, since his family was fleeing religious persecution. It's a bit strange, however, to call him an immigrant when he fled to a different part of the same empire. My conclusions don't matter, though. The core truth of Jesus' birth is that when God became man, he entered the world in a posture of extreme humility and extreme vulnerability, and that posture never changed. Jesus, God made flesh, spent his life as a carpenter and an itinerant preacher. He proved so vulnerable that he was easily executed by the Roman Empire, with only the tiniest band of followers still clinging to their faith. And if we who call ourselves Christians are to truly imitate Jesus, then shouldn't we also place little regard on our own worldly status? Jesus told us to take up our own cross, not to nail others to that terrible tree. My former pastor often used a phrase that has always stuck in my mind: the upside-down kingdom of God. I use it all the time as well. Yes, Jesus is king, but of a very different kind of kingdom, where the first are last, where you love your enemies, where you bless those who persecute you, and where you sacrifice to serve your neighbor. And Jesus established the upside-down nature of his kingdom from his very first moments on earth. When I think of the contrast between Jesus' life and ministry and the will to power that has consumed so many Christians, I'm reminded of the words usually attributed to Mahatma Gandhi: I like your Jesus. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. That's a fair critique. And by that metric, every single one of us will fail. Who among us is truly like Christ? But Gandhi's critique contains a potential fallacy. There's an unspoken implication that people would actually like Christians if we behaved more like Christ. But no, that's demonstrably wrong. It's true that people want to receive love and compassion, that when they encounter Christians who love them and serve them, they tend to like them. Many people do not, however, appreciate it when a Christian loves and serves their enemies. They absolutely do not like it when a Christian refuses to join their political crusade. That's what happened to Jesus. He healed the sick. He caused the lame to walk and the blind to see. But that wasn't enough. A true Messiah was supposed to lead the people to political triumph. When he did not, the religious people cast him aside. When the fateful choice was put before them, the religious people chose Barabbas, an insurrectionist, over Jesus. But Jesus did not endear himself to Rome either. The secular authorities crucified him under a mocking sign calling him Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. In the upside-down kingdom of God, religion is still dangerous, but the danger is flipped. Fundamentalist faiths make religion dangerous to others, the non-believers and heretics who must be made to yield. But Christianity properly lived is dangerous to Christians. It's dangerous to people who refuse to hate those they are told to hate, to people who refuse to oppress, to conquer, to exploit, even when they're told to conquer in the name of God. It was Jesus' humble birth that set the stage. It was the first lesson in a series. To oppress others is to oppress Jesus. To hate others is to hate Jesus. And to love your enemies can be the most dangerous and revolutionary act of them all. And that seems to be a good way to end right before Christmas, even though it's a little short. Thank you for listening. I hope that I will be back to normal schedule next week. I don't plan to travel. And I wish everybody a happy holiday, and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Goodbye. This is Ted on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service.